What is the p-value? Is it statistical evidence? How to define p-value? A p-value is a statistical measure that represents the probability of obtaining a test statistic that is at least as extreme as the one observed in the sample, assuming that the null hypothesis is true. In other words, it is a measure of the strength of evidence against the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the default assumption that there is no significant difference or relationship between two groups or variables in a population. The alternative hypothesis, on the other hand, is the hypothesis that there is a significant difference or relationship between the groups or variables. The p-value is commonly used in hypothesis testing to determine whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. The p-value is compared to a predetermined significance level, alpha, which is typically set at 0.05. If the p-value is less than or equal to alpha, then the null hypothesis is rejected in favor of the alternative hypothesis, indicating that there is sufficient evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. If the p-value is greater than alpha, then the null hypothesis is not rejected, and there is insufficient evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. How p-value is measured? The calculation of a p-value depends on the specific hypothesis test being performed. However, in general, the p-value is calculated as follows. Determine the test statistic. The test statistic is a value that summarizes the difference between the sample data and the null hypothesis. The specific formula for the test statistic will depend on the type of hypothesis test being performed. Determine the null distribution. The null distribution is the distribution of the test statistic assuming that the null hypothesis is true. The null distribution can be determined either mathematically or through simulation. Determine the critical region. The critical region is the set of values of the test statistic that are considered to be unlikely to occur by chance if the null hypothesis is true. The critical region is determined by the significance level, alpha, of the test. Calculate the p-value. The p-value is the probability of obtaining a test statistic that is as extreme as or more extreme than the observed test statistic, given the null distribution and the critical region. The p-value can be calculated using mathematical formulas or by using software that can simulate the null distribution. Compare the p-value to the significance level. If the p-value is less than or equal to the significance level, alpha, then the null hypothesis is rejected. If the p-value is greater than the significance level, then the null hypothesis is not rejected. It is important to note that the p-value is not a measure of the size of the effect or the practical significance of the results, but rather a measure of the strength of the evidence against the null hypothesis. How p-value is used in the supply chain. In supply chain management, p-values can be used to test the significance of relationships between variables, such as demand and inventory levels, lead times and order quantities, or supplier performance and customer satisfaction. These relationships can be modeled using statistical methods, such as regression analysis, time series analysis, or hypothesis testing. For example, a company may want to test whether there is a significant relationship between supplier performance, e.g., delivery reliability, quality of goods, and customer satisfaction. They could collect data on these variables from a sample of customers and suppliers, and then perform a hypothesis test to determine whether there is evidence of a significant relationship. In this case, the null hypothesis would be that there is no significant relationship between supplier performance and customer satisfaction, while the alternative hypothesis would be that there is a significant relationship. The p-value would then be calculated based on the observed data, and compared to the significance level, alpha, to determine whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. By using p-values and hypothesis testing in supply chain management, companies can make data-driven decisions and identify areas for improvement in their operations.